Okay, today's agenda for this U.S. government study session review is the rule of law. We are going to be going over the rule of law first. Then we're going to go ahead and complete activity 4.4.1. Sorry, we're not going to complete it. We're going to discuss activity 4.4.1. Why is the rule of law important? And the first part is going to set you up to be able to complete the second part, which is the actual activity. So if you're watching this live, you'll be able to go back and access the recording. Once it's recorded, you can pause it, you can go back and you can review any section that you need additional help with. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's start with the rule of law. Let's go ahead and review. The rule of law is covered in lesson 4.4, the rule of law. And if we look at that lesson, if we take a closer look, and I'm not going to go over the individual lesson. I want to go over the main points. You can review the lesson on your own. If you've already have read it, this is just going to be a review. If you haven't read it, this is going to help you out a lot as you go into that reading. So the rule of law, what is the rule of law? Well, the rule of law is when all people, citizens, this means government officials as well, they all support and follow the same laws and regulations of the United States Constitution. So everybody follows the laws set up by the United States Constitution. And as a reminder, the U.S. Constitution lays out the function and limits of our government and the rights of us, of the citizens. So if you remember from this entire unit, we've discussed, the lessons have covered the United States Constitution, why it's important, what it does, and it leads up to this. It leads up to the rule of law. So why is the rule of law important? It basically states that no one is above the law, that all people, even the President of the United States, judges, congressmen and congresswomen, everybody must live under the same rules and laws that everyone else does. So we are all equal under the law. Without this policy, it could lead to dictators like Hitler or Stalin, who are covered in this unit. You might have also heard of them from your other classes in world history. And these are dictators who considered themselves above the law. So again, without this policy, you could really have chaos, basically, is what it comes down to, and dictators who rule according to their desires, not to the desires or the needs of the people. So we're going to look at another part of the rule of law, which is the Supremacy Clause. It's part of the United States Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2. This is what it says. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So if you look, I underlined this Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So it establishes that the US Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And I have put down up here at the bottom, what does supremacy even mean? It's a big word. And you can tell it has the word supreme in it, but it is the state or condition of being superior to all others in authority, power, or status. So it basically means you are superior, like the supremacy of the king. Well, in this case, it's the Supremacy Clause is part of the Constitution. It makes the Constitution the supreme law of the land. And the rest of this clause says that no other law is more important or powerful than the Constitution. That laws made at the state level, they can't interfere or violate the United States Constitution. So the state of Alabama cannot make a law that contradicts the United States Constitution. It will be deemed unconstitutional. And if you remember from this unit, it does talk about the role of the Supreme Court in analyzing whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court has the final say. And it goes through an entire process before it reaches the Supreme Court. But if any state passes a law, it can be challenged, eventually makes it up to the Supreme Court. So constitutional supremacy, it's also known as, without the rule of law, without constitutional supremacy, every state would constantly be undermining the federal authority, and there would never be an absolute truth or law in the land. So everybody would have their own sets of rules and regulations, and we might as well all be independent nations. So in the end, the Constitution is the final say in all legal activity. Without the rule of law, as we said earlier, we could have dictators. We could be at the risk of tyranny, meaning a dictator or somebody who has absolute rule, absolute choice in everything, whether it's military, education, farming, you name it, one person, or even a small group of individuals could just lead the nation. We could also risk having lawlessness, so total chaos and violence. And we're going to look at some examples where violence has been a result of the breakdown of the rule of law. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at that. So what are some examples in the United States, internationally, historically, in modern times? And then what were the consequences? What are the consequences when there is no rule of law for individuals such as ourselves and for an entire nation? So in the United States, in the 1960s, and this, again, this is all in the lesson. I'm just trying to condense it for you. And these are all parts of the essay question. So pay attention to the content and also what you can put in your essay later on. So you could recall like, oh, I remember from the review, this was part, give some examples. Well, the Watergate Scandal was an example, the KKK. So in the United States, we have some examples. The Watergate Scandal, again, it's in the lesson. You can get more details there. And this happened when President Richard Nixon was in power. He was president from 1969 to 1974, and he was responsible for a cover-up. There was a group of individuals who broke into the Democratic headquarters, and this was during a re-election campaign, trying to get information. And Nixon was blamed for basically obstruction of justice, meaning he tried for the longest time to fool investigators. And he resigned before he was ever removed from office. So this was a really big obstruction of justice, mainly because he covered up this particular event. And there were some other things that Nixon was going to be, impeached. In other words, he was going to be brought to a trial. But he was going to be impeached for other things such as possible war crimes that were going on in Southeast Asia. But the one he mainly was being charged for was this obstruction of justice during the Watergate Scandal. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, they are also an example of how the rule of law has broken down. They used violence and murder to achieve their goals. And some law enforcement officials also covered up for them and supported their actions. So we're not going to get into specifics, but the KKK, especially during the 1950s, 40s, and even, soon after slavery ended, was responsible, for murdering and violence against Blacks, African Americans, and denying people of their civil and constitutional rights. Then we have examples of police corruption or brutality during Prohibition. So Prohibition, if you remember, it was a time when the United States actually banned, through a constitutional amendment, the sale and transportation of alcohol, and many police would be bribed. They would turn their eyes, or they might even be part of these large rings where they would get money for allowing alcohol into their counties, into their cities, into their states. So there was, very early corruption. Again, we talked about the KKK and civil rights. And police participation with the KKK, and also in suppressing African American rights during the civil rights movement and during the civil rights era, and then current abuses of powers that we have all come to see caught on camera in our day and age. And one that goes along with the civil rights era and the KKK is interfering with the right to vote. So there has been a breakdown of the rule of law. Many states and counties created their own laws to keep African Americans from voting. This included creating really high poll taxes. There were tests such as literacy tests. In some cases, these tests would involve like really difficult geometry problems, which have nothing to do with your right to vote. So interfering with the right to vote is another example within the United States. So some international examples. Again, this is also part of the lesson. You can go back and read more details. We have Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. He was a dictator from 1929 to 1953, and he wanted to change Russia from a peasant and farming society into this industrial and military superpower. And he wanted to use communism to do that. So he wanted to consolidate property within the government, and as well as agricultural operations and just about everything. So he killed over 15 million of his own people to achieve his political goals. He would commit ethnic cleansings. He was responsible for many famines. He sent people to labor camps. He executed potential enemies, and he even installed a secret police and asked neighbors to spy on each other, all to reach his own political goals and to ensure the political goals of communism. Then we have Hitler, who many of you are familiar with from your history classes. He was a German leader from 1933 to 1945, and he's responsible for over 12 million non-combat deaths. And what that means is this does not include World War II. This is just 12 million people that he murdered to achieve his goals, to create a superior, what he wanted to be called a superior Aryan race. And this included, the majority were Jews. It also included gypsies, mentally, physically handicapped people, a lot of Poles, people from Poland, communists, as well as homosexuals. So Hitler is an example when the rule of law breaks down. And then we have Saddam Hussein. This is much more current than Stalin and Hitler. He was the president, he was a dictator of Iraq from 1979 to 2003. And one of his first moves as president of Iraq was to remove people from his party who he believed were opposing him and who he believed had ulterior motives. He removes them in one of the very first meetings of his cabinet on public television, and he executes some of them. So anyone who was opposed to him, he removed, and he even executed people for opposing him that were within his own political party. He also used chemical weapons against his own people, especially, most notably, the Kurds, who are considered a very different ethnicity. They are more of Iranian people, and they have several different religious beliefs. So he used chemical weapons against the Kurds in northern Iraq. He also invaded Iran and Kuwait. So he is known to have just used his own powers to achieve his own ends. And this was in the 1980s and 1990s that this all occurred. And I have noted here at the bottom, see page 12 in lesson 4.4 for additional information on international examples of when the rule of law has broken down. So we see what happens when the rule of law is not obeyed. People come into power who probably should not be in power. They abuse their powers, and then the nation and its inhabitants, everybody suffers. In the case of Russia, everybody suffered through famines and labor camps, ethnic cleansing. Same thing with Hitler. You know, most everybody suffered as well under Saddam Hussein. So again, everybody suffers under the breakdown of the rule of law in different, although it could be in different ways depending on the nation and the historical situation. Okay, because we don't have anybody left in our study session, looks like we had some people leave early, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna move on to the actual assignment. So in your class, you're going to see this. These are the instructions for activity 4.4.1. Why is the rule of law important? And it's a little bit lengthy, and it's because you need to write a 4-paragraph essay. And it says, using the information from this lesson, write a 4-paragraph essay that answers this question. Why is the rule of law important? And what can happen in its absence or breakdown? So in your essay, again, it's a 4-paragraph essay, you need to do the following. And this is it's giving you an outline of how to write it, which is really nice. And this is gonna help you practice your writing. So you need to have paragraph 1. You need to explain what the rule of law is and why it is important. So paragraph 1, explain what the rule of law is and why it is important. In paragraph 2, you're going to describe 3 historical or modern examples of when there was an absence or breakdown of the rule of law. Paragraph 3, you're going to explain the consequences that have occurred because of the rule of law. You're going to explain the consequences that have occurred because the rule of law was not being enforced. And then paragraph 4, you're going to summarize why the rule of law is important for protecting you, your family, and your community. So if you notice, we reviewed paragraphs, we reviewed the content for paragraph 1, 2, and 3 in the review. So you have a lot of the information. You can probably write your essay based off of the information just in this review, but it's better that you go back and you read the lesson again. And then paragraph 4, you need to summarize why the rule of law is important for protecting you, your family, and your community. And we're going to go over that in more detail here in a minute, but basically that is your own opinion. So paragraph 1 through 3, these are based on actual content, and paragraph 4 is your ideas of why the rule of law is important. The instructions also say that you should consider writing your draft in a separate Word document so you can plan and edit your essay. And you can then copy and paste your final essay into the Dropbox. That's up to you. Everybody has a different process for writing. In this particular essay, we're not going to go over every single detail of how to write your essay. We're basically just going to review what you should have in each paragraph because it's already laid out for you. You need to have 4 paragraphs. Also, don't forget that a paragraph has 5 to 7 sentences. So you can also refer, there's a rubric, which we'll look at in a little bit. You can refer to the rubric in the instructions on how you will be graded. Okay, paragraph 1 asks you to explain what the rule of law is and why it is important. Again, remember, a paragraph has 5 to 7 sentences. You need to have 5 to 7 sentences. First, you need to define the rule of law. That's going to be the easiest way to start this essay. So what is it and what does it state? So define it. What is the rule of law and what does it state? And then, secondly, state why it is important. So what does it do? What does it protect? Again, if you go back and you review this lesson or review this video, in the first half, we talked about all this. We talked about what the rule of law is, what it states, and what it does and protects. And I have provided sentence starters for each one of these paragraphs. So if you're not sure how to start, you can start it. Here's an example. The rule of law is, and then you would go on to define it and what it states. And then you could say it is important because, that's where you would say it's important because of what it does and what it protects. So you're writing your essay and you're starting paragraph 1. Use that sentence starter just to get you started, and then make sure that you define the rule of law and you say why it's important. and that will take 5 to 7 sentences. In paragraph 2, it asks you to describe 3 historical or modern examples of when there was an absence or breakdown of the rule of law. Again, paragraph is 5 to 7 sentences. So you need 3 historical or modern examples of when there was an absence or breakdown of the rule of law. Again, refer to this earlier lesson. We talked about examples in the United States. We talked about Watergate, the KKK, police corruption, and we also looked at some international leaders such as Hitler, Stalin, and Hussein, and you can use those examples of when there was a breakdown of the rule of law. You can even come up with your own examples. I'm perfectly okay with that so long as it's based on facts that you have, that you can provide sources for. That's totally fine with me. And at the bottom, I have provided a sentence starter. So you have your first paragraph done, and then you get onto your second paragraph, and you can start it this way. Some examples of the absence or breakdown of the rule of law can be seen in both the United States and in other nations. For example, in Soviet Russia, and then he would go on to talk about Stalin and what Stalin did to basically undermine the rule of law. So paragraph 2 asks you to describe 3 examples. They could be historical or modern examples of when there was an absence or breakdown of rule of law. All right, paragraph 3 explains the consequence. Paragraph 3 says, explain the consequences that have occurred because the rule of law wasn't being enforced. 5 to 7 sentences need to be written to explain this. So what are some of the consequences? So this paragraph needs to address what has happened when the rule of law was not being enforced or respected. Some examples: what was the result of Watergate? What was the result of Hitler, Stalin, etc.? What happened to the people, and what happened to governments? What happened to voting? What happened to justice? Make sure that you review what we talked about earlier and also review the lesson for this. So what happened when the rule of law was not being enforced? Again, in the case of Stalin, he created large famines, he killed his own people, he killed those who opposed him. So it was really bad for an entire nation and its people. And I have a sentence starter here. There are many consequences if the rule of law is not enforced. For example, so again, paragraph 3, you need to explain the consequences of what happens when the rule of law has broken down. And in paragraph 4, you're going to summarize why the rule of law is important for protecting you, your family, and your community. This is 5 to 7 sentences as well. And this paragraph, keep in mind, is your own personal opinion. It's based on what you learned from this lesson, from the unit, from the historical examples. It is all based on your own personal opinion. So why is the rule of law important? Why is it important? For protecting you, your family, your community, the nation. And I have provided a sentence starter. The rule of law is important to me because... So again, paragraph 4 is your summary paragraph. Why is the rule of law important for protecting you, your family, your community, and your nation? We're going to look at an example of an essay that was written by a student. So let's go ahead and let's look at that. So I'm going to break it down by paragraph. So paragraph 1, this student is going to define, and they're going to say why the rule of law is important. So paragraph 1, the rule of law is the act of placing the United States Constitution above all people in the country. This puts all Americans on a more even level, and everyone has to obey the same laws. This is important because it limits the power of the government and places that power ultimately in the people. The rule of law restricts giving power to any one person, making us all more equal. So they have said what the rule of law is and why it's important. So paragraph 2 asks you to give examples of when there was no rule of law. Throughout history, there have been plenty of examples where there was no rule of law. In Nazi Germany throughout World War II, Hitler placed himself above the law. Hitler committed a genocide against minorities and disabled people across most of Europe, including Germany. Another example of someone placed, so that's number one. Number two, another example of someone placing themselves above the law was Saddam Hussein, who was a military dictator. Hussein executed or jailed all potential opposition to his reign, as well as Shiites encouraged discriminating against them based solely on their religion. Okay, number three, my final example of a dictator placing themselves above the law is Kim Jong-un, who is still a present-day dictator in North Korea. Jong-un and his family have placed themselves in power. He has unlimited executive control and is known for human rights abuses against his own people. All right, so that's paragraph 2. In paragraph 3, we're going to look at the consequences. There are a lot of consequences that have occurred because the rule of law was not being enforced. For example, leaders have attempted genocide on a minority. Another potential consequence from a lack of the rule of law is chaos or even a revolution against government. Other consequences could be a naive population believing whatever a leader says because they are all powerful. And then the summary paragraph, remember this paragraph has to do with why is the rule of law important? Why is it important to you? The rule of law is an important part of protecting the general populace for a lot of reasons. First and foremost is to prevent tyranny from happening. Another reason that the rule of law is important is because it prevents one person from holding too much power. It keeps the government in check. The final reason why the rule of law is important is because it keeps us all equal and keeps the powers of the government ultimately in the people. So this student has summarized why the rule of law is important in their last paragraph. They've provided 4 paragraphs with 5 to 7 sentences. And this example is available on the video, but if you need a copy of this example, please let me know and I will get that to you. And of course, before you submit your work, please make sure you read over it. Edit, you can also have someone else edit it for you. Check to see if it makes sense, check for spelling and punctuation errors, and of course, read the instructions again to make sure you have included everything that needs to be included in order to receive a passing grade. So again, edit your work and then read the instructions before submitting, just so you know that you are on the right track. You can always redo work. That's one thing that's really nice about this online program is, let's say you don't do so well on your first try. Your teacher will usually, if you score below a 60%, so 60% is a grade of a D. So anything below a D, your teacher will usually, or should give you a retry. If for some reason they haven't, contact them and say, hey, I would like to redo this assignment. So again, if you feel like you can improve your work, whether it's an essay, a quiz, a test, contact your teacher if they have not already set a retry. All right, so any questions, please let me know. Any questions about the activity, any questions about the lesson, please reach out to me. And then how will this be graded? I was gonna have, let's go ahead and look at the rubric to see how you will be graded. And of course, before we move away from this slide, let me know what other types of study sessions you would like to see for this class, for social studies, and any future classes. So let's go ahead and let's look at the activity, how it's going to be graded. Okay, so I am in the course here, and I'm going to go into why is the rule of law important. Okay, this is what your screen is going to look like, and we already looked at the instructions. And then down here, there is what is called a rubric, and you're going to see this. You already have seen it in this class, but I just want to review what a rubric is. A rubric is essentially a guide that tells you how you're going to score and what you need to be, what needs to be included in your assignment in order to score a certain way. I'm going to expand this a little bit. And on this rubric, it has the category. So basically paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, paragraph 4. If you're looking to get an A, you need to fall in this range. Exceeds expectations. And for each paragraph, you need to meet all of these expectations. And for example, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, I just want to show you how to read this. So in paragraph 1, if you want an A, you need to say, or it says that the position statement provides a clear, strong statement of the author's position on the topic. Meets expectations anywhere from a D to a B, and does not meet is anything less than a D. So if, you know, paragraph 1, you don't have a position statement, it's not clear, or it's missing, you're not going to meet that standard. So make sure you read this rubric so that you know what to expect for a grade. Again, this is an A, this is a B through a D, and this is anything below a D, which is an F. And again, you can always redo assignments for a better grade. All right, well, thank you very much for attending today's session. Make sure that if you have not done so already, that you send me a chat with your first and your last name so that I can apply extra credit. Contact me here as well if you need extra help, or if you want a copy of the slides or even a copy of the essay. I will go ahead and I will send out a chat message as well as an email that has a link to this recording. It probably will not be available until next week, so make sure that you check your email as well as your chat messages. And like I said, if you haven't done so already, send me a private chat with your first and your last name so I can give you extra credits and my contact information. So if you need to get a hold of me, here's a slide that has my phone number, and this is a texting number. So feel free to call, leave a voicemail, text me at this number here. My email address, so you can contact me that way as well, in addition to chat from your class. And make sure that you spell my last name correctly. Actually, make sure that you spell all of this correctly, because if I do not respond to you, that means that I have not received your email. So please make sure you spell my name correctly and that you spell Graduation Alliance correctly as well. And my office hours are Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you need my help outside of those hours, I am available. You can just message me or call me and say, hey, can we set up some time outside of those hours? And I will be more than happy to adjust my schedule so that I can help you out. Because I know we all have very different schedules. Some of us work nights, some of us work days, some of us work weekends, some of us work weekdays. So that's it for today's session. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.